It wasn't until 1960 that the two major party candidates for president agreed to debate, this time on television. The Nixon-Kennedy debates finally gave the public a chance to hear and see the two men face off. Well, not really, according to Lepore.
What they agreed to do, and the only thing they were willing to do when they agreed to debate, was essentially hold a joint press conference. And the two candidates would not speak to one another, but would instead take turns fielding questions from the panel of reporters. And even ABC News was pretty unhappy about it and refused to call the Nixon-Kennedy debate a debate. They billed it as a joint appearance because it was not a debate.
Like FDR, Lepore says, most nominees for president don't like the unpredictability of an authentic debate.
Anyone who's sponsored the presidential debates has tried really hard to get the candidates to speak to one another, to refute one another, to challenge one another, and have had very little success. It's really the candidates and the campaigns that want to have this joint press conference instead of an actual debate.
Lepore says there's an irony here. Despite candidate reluctance, political sparring and debate have been a crucial part of American civic culture since the Republic's first days.
That's how the government was devised in the first place. That's what the Constitutional Convention was. That's what the ratifying conventions were. It's not possible to have self-government without debate. Civic life in a democracy is founded on debate. We have to be willing to meet face-to-face and argue about ideas and support our arguments with evidence. I think that's true from the first colonial assemblies to the present.
As Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump prepare for a rematch Sunday evening, we're going to take a closer look at the traditions of debate in America. We'll hear why Americans latched on to the epic debates between Abraham Lincoln and Illinois Senator Stephen Douglas in 1858. We'll also discuss the legacy of slavery and race in America through a memorable encounter between James Baldwin and William F. Buckley in 1965. And we'll chat with former Michigan Governor Jennifer Granholm. She helped Vice President Biden prepare for his debate with Alaska Governor Sarah Palin in 2008.
But first, Jill Lepore mentioned the debates at the Constitutional Convention between politicians like James Madison and George Mason, but they weren't the only ones who locked horns. In the early years of the Republic, young men across the former colonies created their own debating societies. They were modeled on college debate clubs, but anyone could join, and they offered members a lot more than just camaraderie.
The ideal was that learning to speak by debating was connected to the process of helped improve everyone's manners and their sense of mutual knowledge. I think the ideal at the heart of all this was that it made society more civilized overall.
And young men need this desperately, wouldn't you say? Even today.
But it's also, I mean, if you think about it, learning how to speak well benefited people on all levels.
Right. So, Carolyn, you might say that these are adolescent or young men trying to figure out how to make their way in the world, and the world itself is highly volatile. Things are changing. You might even say that the United States is an adolescent nation, figuring out who it is, and this convergence of the personal and the political is very powerful in the case of your club members.
That's right. I mean, what a club looked like was they probably met once a week. They usually met for up to 4 hours on one evening, so it was a long evening of camaraderie and messing around and probably drinking and eating. The crucial to the formation of these clubs and these would-be self-made men was that they were also secret. If you made a mistake, you could nevertheless learn from it within this kind of secret environment. You couldn't interrupt one another, and the idea of having everyone participate helped to foster the idea that everyone had a place. And so if you think about the debating society as a kind of a metaphor for something larger, it sets up the notion that all people have a place in the conversation of the day.
What were some of the things they argued about? Could you set up some of the debates that they were having?
They often sound whimsical. That is, some kinds of questions that they would have debated were, is polygamy useful to society? Or should public brothels be tolerated? Which is better for society?
These are secret, huh?
Exactly. Which is better for society, ambition or avarice? And so in all of these ways, these are not necessarily serious questions.
And Carolyn, as you've suggested, there's also an art to listening and being entertained by the exchange of ideas and critically evaluating who the winners and losers are. And the audience is really important in this whole culture you're talking about.
That's right. I mean, we might express real amazement that people would listen for, 4 hours to Abraham Lincoln and Stephen Douglas debate. We now listen in very different ways than 19th century Americans would have. But nevertheless, I think the mode remains crucial to how we think through political issues.
That's an interesting point, Carolyn. How would your audiences in the early Republic and into the 19th century listen differently? There's an art to it. It's not something you just are born with.
Well, I think that it's too simple to say that today we're more moved by personal style. But we've lost, I think, that notion that people had in the 18th and 19th century for trying to come to a conclusion based on the arguments presented, whether or not you might objectively feel one way or the other on an issue. That's no longer a part of the way we learn.
Well, would you say, Carolyn, then that the audiences that you've studied want to hear an argument unfold and they're patient enough to be there for 3 or 4 hours?
Yeah, I think that's a really nice way of putting it.
Well, Carolyn, you're a young tyros with their oratorical skills honed in their clubs, go on to careers in business and law. They also become politicians. How important is the oratory that they learned in these clubs to American politics?
Well, debating societies remained really popular through a good chunk of the 19th century, and debate would ultimately become a feature of the two-party system in the U.S. The idea that people need to be persuaded, that they need to have an actual person standing in front of them, making arguments, and persuading their peers in a way that both demonstrates respect for the people listening and an eagerness to persuade them, is a really crucial aspect of how our political system looks even today.
Carolyn Eastman is a historian at Virginia Commonwealth University and the author of A Nation of Speechifiers, Making an American Public After the Revolution. Earlier we heard from Jill LaPointe. She's a historian at Harvard University and a staff writer at The New Yorker.
It's time to take a short break. When we return, we'll travel back 50 years to hear James Baldwin and William F. Buckley Jr. in a debate that still resonates today.
All right. We're going to park Petro at the Indiana-Ohio line. We're going to be about 515 miles away from where we got it.
All right.
We're going to park. We're going to eat Petro in the morning at Iron Skillet.
All right.
Then, what? We're going to get up early. o'clock and like 6 o'clock in the morning.